Snowflakes drifted through the skeletal branches of the Vosges Mountains, each crystal catching what little light penetrated the dense canopy above. Sergeant James Mitchell pulled his wool collar tighter against the December wind, his breath forming small clouds that dissipated quickly in the frigid air. The forest floor crunched beneath his boots as he led his two-man patrol deeper into enemy territory, every step calculated to minimize noise, while maintaining their eastward advance toward the reported German artillery positions. Mitchell's weathered hands gripped his M1 Garand with practiced ease, though his mind wandered momentarily to the letter from home tucked inside his breast pocket. His mother had written about the harvest, about neighbors whose sons wouldn't be coming home, about the empty chair at their kitchen table where his younger brother Tommy used to sit before Normandy claimed him 3 months ago. The weight of that loss pressed against Mitchell's chest like a physical thing, driving him forward through this frozen hell with a determination that bordered on recklessness. Behind him, Corporal Danny Sullivan from Boston moved with the careful precision of a man who'd learned that carelessness meant death. At 19, Sullivan had already seen more combat than most veterans twice his age, his boyish face marked by the 1,000-yard stare that came from watching too many friends die. Private First Class Marcus Washington brought up the rear, his dark eyes constantly scanning their flanks for movement. Washington had joined the unit just 2 weeks ago, a replacement for another casualty in this endless war. But his steady nerves and sharp shooting had already earned him respect among the veterans. The mission briefing had been straightforward enough. French resistance fighters reported German artillery pieces positioned somewhere in these mountains, guns that had been raining death on Allied positions for the past week. Command wanted coordinates, troop strength estimates, and, if possible, intelligence about German defensive preparations for the expected spring offensive. What command hadn't mentioned was the bitter cold that turned rifle bolts sluggish, the snow that made every footstep a potential betrayal of position, or the way the forest seemed to swallow sound until a man couldn't tell if that crack of a branch came from his own movement or an enemy patrol 50 yards away. Mitchell raised his fist, bringing the patrol to an immediate halt. Something had caught his attention, a break in the natural pattern of the forest ahead. Through the swirling snow, he could make out what appeared to be a small clearing, unusual in this dense woodland. More concerning was the complete absence of bird calls or small animal movement in the area, suggesting recent human activity. He motioned for Sullivan and Washington to take flanking positions while he moved forward to investigate. As Mitchell crept closer to the clearing's edge, the scene that emerged from behind the snow-laden pine boughs struck him like a physical blow. In the center of the open space stood a massive oak tree, its trunk scarred by what appeared to be recent knife cuts. Bound to that tree with rough hemp rope was a young woman, her head hanging forward in unconsciousness, dark hair falling across her face like a curtain. She wore the remnants of what had once been a gray wool dress, now torn and stained, offering little protection against the elements that had clearly been working on her for hours. But it was the crude wooden sign hanging from her neck that made Mitchell's blood run cold. Carved into the weathered board in jagged letters was a single German word, Spien, spy. Below it, someone had scratched additional markings, symbols that Mitchell didn't recognize but which carried an unmistakable air of menace. The woman's wrists, bound above her head, showed dark stains where the rope had cut into her flesh. Her lips had taken on the blue-tinged pallor of severe hypothermia, and her breathing, barely visible in the cold air, came in shallow, irregular gasps. Mitchell's training screamed at him to observe, assess, and report. Enemy personnel were not his responsibility, unless they posed an immediate threat or offered intelligence value. The standing orders were clear. Do not engage with enemy civilians without explicit authorization from command. Providing aid to enemy personnel could be construed as fraternization or worse, potentially compromising operational security. But as he watched the woman's labored breathing, as he saw the way her body had gone limp against the restraints, Mitchell felt something deeper than military protocol stirring in his chest. He thought of Tommy, barely 18 when the machine gun nest at Omaha Beach had cut him down. He thought of his mother's letters, of Sunday dinners where she insisted on setting a place for her missing son. He thought of the photograph in his wallet showing a family that would never be whole again. And then he looked at this woman, this enemy, dying alone in a frozen forest, abandoned by her own people to serve as some twisted example of wartime justice. Sullivan appeared at his shoulder, having moved up when Mitchell failed to signal the all-clear. The corporal's eyes widened as he took in the scene, his hand instinctively moving to his rifle before Mitchell's gesture stopped him. Washington joined them moments later, his face grim as he processed what they'd discovered. For several long seconds, the three Americans stood in silence, each man wrestling with the implications of what lay before them. The woman stirred slightly, a soft moan escaping her lips as consciousness flickered back. Her head lifted slowly, revealing a face that couldn't have belonged to someone older than 25. Despite the bruising around her left eye and the cuts on her cheek, despite the pallor of cold and exhaustion, there was something in her features that spoke of intelligence and determination. When her eyes opened, they were the color of winter sky, and they fixed on Mitchell with a mixture of fear and desperate hope that cut through his military conditioning like a blade. She tried to speak, but only a hoarse whisper emerged. Mitchell found himself stepping forward before conscious thought could stop him, his canteen already in his hand. The woman's eyes tracked his movement, widening as she took in his American uniform, the distinctive helmet, the weapons that marked him as one of the enemy soldiers she'd been taught to fear. But when Mitchell unscrewed the cap of his canteen and held it toward her lips, she didn't pull away. The water was cold, nearly freezing, but it seemed to revive her somewhat. She managed several small sips before pulling back, her eyes never leaving Mitchell's face. When she spoke again, her voice was clearer, though still weak from exposure and dehydration. The words came in German, rapid and desperate, but Mitchell caught enough to understand that she was trying to explain something, to tell him that she wasn't what the sign proclaimed her to be. Mitchell's German was limited to basic phrases learned during training, but he managed to convey that he understood she was in distress. More importantly, he began working at the knots that held her to the tree, his fingers clumsy in the cold, but determined. The rope was thick and had been tied with military precision, designed to hold against any escape attempt. As he worked, he could feel Sullivan and Washington watching him, could sense their confusion and concern about his decision to aid an enemy civilian. When the ropes finally gave way, the woman collapsed forward into Mitchell's arms, her legs unable to support her weight after hours of being bound. She was lighter than he'd expected, her body showing the effects of prolonged hunger and exposure. As he helped her to sit against the base of the tree, she looked up at him with an expression of gratitude so profound that it made his chest tighten. In broken English, she whispered a single word, "Danke." Mitchell found himself responding in kind, his voice gentle despite the circumstances. "You're safe now. We'll help you." The words came out before he could consider their implications, before he could weigh them against military protocol or strategic considerations. They were simply human words, offered from one person to another in a moment of desperate need. The woman's name, as she managed to explain in halting English supplemented by gestures and the few German words Mitchell knew, was Greta Hoffman. She was 24 years old, trained as a nurse in Berlin before the war had consumed everything she'd known. Her father had been a doctor, she explained, a man who'd spoken out against the medical experiments being conducted in the camps, who'd paid for his conscience with his life. Greta had been forced to work in a German military hospital, treating wounded soldiers while watching Allied prisoners receive substandard care or worse. But Greta had done more than simply follow orders. Over the course of several months, she'd managed to help 3 American airmen escape from the hospital where she worked. She'd provided them with civilian clothes, medical supplies, and information about safe routes to the Swiss border. Her activities had eventually been discovered by SS Oberführer Heinrich Krüger, a man whose reputation for cruelty was matched only by his fanatical devotion to Nazi ideology. Krüger had decided to make an example of Greta, but not through the quick justice of a firing squad. Instead, he'd had her brought to this remote forest and tied to the tree with the spy sign as a warning to others who might consider helping Allied personnel. The plan was to leave her here until exposure and starvation did their work, then display her body as a testament to the fate that awaited traitors to the Reich. As Greta told her story, Mitchell felt his understanding of the war's complexity deepening. Here was a German citizen who'd risked everything to help American soldiers, who'd been condemned by her own government, for showing the kind of humanity that military training sometimes tried to suppress. The irony wasn't lost on him, that he was now faced with the same choice she'd made: follow orders and preserve his own safety, or risk everything to help an enemy in need. The decision, when it came, felt inevitable. Mitchell couldn't leave Greta to die in this forest any more than she'd been able to watch Allied prisoners suffer without trying to help. But helping her meant more than just cutting her free from the tree. She was in no condition to travel, suffering from hypothermia, dehydration, and exhaustion. Getting her to safety would require a journey of at least 15 kilometers through enemy-controlled territory, with German patrols likely searching for both her and any Allied soldiers who might have aided her escape. Sullivan and Washington had listened to the exchange with growing concern. They understood enough of the situation to realize that their sergeant was proposing to risk their lives for an enemy civilian, regardless of her apparent innocence or the aid she'd provided to American personnel. It went against everything they'd been taught about operational security and mission priorities. But they also understood Mitchell, had served with him long enough to recognize the steel in his voice when he'd made up his mind about something. The debate was brief, but intense. Sullivan argued for leaving Greta with basic supplies and continuing their mission, pointing out that their primary responsibility was to gather intelligence about German artillery positions. Washington suggested that they could report her location to command and let higher authorities decide how to handle the situation. But Mitchell had already begun planning their route to Allied lines, his mind working through the tactical challenges of moving an injured civilian through hostile territory. Greta's knowledge of the local area proved invaluable in planning their escape route. Despite her weakened condition, she was able to describe paths through the forest that avoided known German checkpoints and patrol routes. She knew of an abandoned farmhouse about 8 kilometers to the west, where they could rest and treat her injuries more thoroughly. Most importantly, she understood the German military mindset well enough to predict how Kruger would organize his search efforts. The SS officer would expect any rescue attempt to head directly west toward Allied lines, so he'd concentrate his patrols along the most obvious routes. But Greta suggested a more circuitous path that would take them north initially, following a series of hunting trails that local resistance fighters had used to move supplies and personnel. It would add several hours to their journey, but it offered the best chance of avoiding detection until they were close enough to Allied positions to signal for help. Mitchell made the decision to abandon their original mission. The artillery positions would have to wait. Getting Greta to safety had become his primary objective. He knew that this choice would require explanation when they returned to base, that his commanding officer would want to understand why a reconnaissance patrol had turned into a rescue mission. But as he looked at Greta, saw the determination in her eyes, despite her physical weakness, Mitchell knew he could live with whatever consequences awaited him. The journey began in the early afternoon, with Mitchell supporting Greta, while Sullivan and Washington maintained security on their flanks. Progress was slow, limited by Greta's condition and the need to avoid detection. Every few hundred meters they had to stop to allow her to rest, to check for signs of pursuit, to reassess their route based on changing conditions. The snow continued to fall, which helped obscure their tracks but also made movement more difficult and increased the risk of exposure. As they traveled, Mitchell found himself learning more about Greta's background and motivations. She spoke of growing up in Berlin before the war, of studying medicine because she wanted to help people, of watching her country transform into something she no longer recognized. Her father's death had been a turning point, the moment when she'd decided that following orders wasn't enough, that she had to actively resist the evil she saw around her. In return, Mitchell shared his own story. He told her about the farm in Ohio where he'd grown up, about Tommy's decision to enlist after Pearl Harbor, about the letter that had arrived 3 months ago, informing his family that their youngest son had died on a beach in France. He spoke of his mother's grief, of his father's silent anger, of his own struggle to understand how the world had come to this point where young men died in foreign countries for causes that sometimes seemed too large to comprehend. The conversation helped pass the time and served another purpose. It humanized each of them in the other's eyes. Greta began to see Mitchell not as an enemy soldier, but as a man who'd lost his brother to the same war that had destroyed her family. Mitchell recognized in Greta the same sense of moral obligation that had driven him to cut her free from that tree, The same refusal to stand by while others suffered that had motivated her to help Allied prisoners. Their first major challenge came as they approached the abandoned farmhouse Greta had described. Washington, scouting ahead, spotted fresh tire tracks in the snow leading to the building. German vehicles had been there recently, possibly within the last few hours. The farmhouse might be under surveillance or worse, occupied by enemy forces waiting for exactly the kind of rescue attempt they were making. Mitchell called a halt while they assessed the situation. Through his binoculars, he could see no movement around the building, no signs of current occupation. But the tire tracks were unmistakable, and they suggested that German forces were actively searching the area. Kruger had apparently organized his manhunt more quickly and efficiently than they'd hoped. The decision to bypass the farmhouse meant finding alternative shelter as darkness approached. Greta's condition was deteriorating. The cold and exertion were taking their toll, despite Mitchell's efforts to keep her warm and hydrated. They needed to get her out of the weather soon, but their options were limited in this remote area where any structure might harbor enemy forces. It was Greta who suggested the solution. She remembered a small hunting cabin deeper in the forest, a place her father had taken her as a child during happier times. It was primitive, little more than a shed with a fireplace, but it would provide shelter from the wind and snow. More importantly, it was off any main trail, unlikely to be discovered by German patrols unless they were conducting a systematic search of every building in the area. The cabin proved to be exactly as Greta had described, a single room with rough wooden walls, a stone fireplace, and a few pieces of basic furniture. More importantly, it contained a small supply of firewood and some emergency provisions left by hunters. Within an hour, Mitchell had a fire burning, and Greta was beginning to show signs of recovery as warmth returned to her body. As night fell, they took turns keeping watch while the others rested. Mitchell found himself studying Greta's face in the firelight, noting the intelligence in her eyes, the strength that had enabled her to survive Kruger's punishment and maintain hope even in the darkest circumstances. She caught him looking and smiled, an expression that transformed her features and reminded him that beneath the trauma and exhaustion was a young woman whose life had been derailed by forces beyond her control. Their conversation that evening ranged across many topics, from their families and backgrounds to their hopes for what might come after the war. Greta spoke of wanting to return to medicine, to use her skills to help rebuild what the war had destroyed. Mitchell talked about the farm, about his plans to expand the operation his father had built, about the possibility of starting a family once the fighting ended. For a few hours, sitting by the fire in that remote cabin, they were able to forget about the war raging around them and simply be two people sharing stories and dreams. But reality intruded with the dawn. Washington, taking the early morning watch, spotted movement in the forest about a kilometer to the south. Through binoculars, he identified at least 6 German soldiers moving in a search pattern, working their way systematically through the area. They were still some distance away, but their direction of travel would bring them to the cabin within a few hours, unless something changed their course. Mitchell made the decision to move immediately. Greta was stronger after a night of rest and warmth, but she was still far from fully recovered. The final push to Allied lines would be the most dangerous part of their journey, as they'd be moving through the area where German and American forces were most likely to encounter each other. The risk of being caught in crossfire or mistaken for enemy forces by their own side added another layer of complexity to an already perilous situation. They left the cabin as the sun was rising, moving as quickly as Greta's condition would allow. The snow had stopped during the night, but the temperature had dropped even further, turning their breath into clouds of vapor that could potentially give away their position. Mitchell set a pace that balanced speed with stealth, knowing that they needed to reach Allied lines before the German search parties could close the net around them. The forest began to thin as they approached the area where American and German forces faced each other across a landscape scarred by artillery and small arms fire. The trees showed damage from recent fighting, their trunks splintered by shell fragments, their branches stripped bare by machine gun fire. The ground itself bore the marks of war, shell craters filled with frozen water, abandoned equipment half buried in snow, the occasional grave marker where someone had fallen and been hastily buried by their comrades. It was in this devastated landscape that they encountered SS Oberfuhrer Heinrich Kruger and his search party. The German officer appeared suddenly from behind a cluster of damaged trees, his distinctive black uniform marking him immediately as SS rather than regular Wehrmacht. Behind him came 4 soldiers, their weapons trained on the small group of Americans and their German companion. Kruger was a man in his 40s, tall and lean with the kind of pale eyes that seemed to look through rather than at the people around him. His uniform was immaculate despite the conditions, his bearing that of someone accustomed to absolute authority. When he spoke, his English was precise and unaccented, the product of extensive education and training. "Sergeant Mitchell, I presume," Kruger said, his voice carrying an undertone of amusement. "You have caused me considerable inconvenience with your misguided humanitarian gesture. I trust you understand that your interference in German military justice cannot be overlooked." Mitchell stepped slightly forward, placing himself between Kruger and Greta. His rifle was ready, though he knew that any sudden movement would likely result in all of them being cut down. Sullivan and Washington had taken positions on either side, their weapons trained on the German soldiers, but they were outnumbered and caught in the open with limited cover. "She's a civilian," Mitchell replied, his voice steady despite the tension of the situation. "Whatever she's accused of, leaving her to die in the forest isn't justice." Kruger's smile was cold and predatory. "Justice, Sergeant, is whatever serves the interests of the Reich. This woman betrayed her country by aiding enemy personnel. The punishment for such treason is death, though I had intended to make it a more educational experience for others who might consider similar actions." Greta stepped forward, her voice stronger than it had been since Mitchell first found her. "I helped wounded men who were being denied medical care. If that's treason, then I'm proud to be a traitor to your Reich." The SS officer's expression darkened at her defiance. "You will return with me to face proper justice. As for these American soldiers, they will be treated as prisoners of war, though their interference in German affairs may complicate their status." Mitchell knew that surrender wasn't an option. Kruger's reputation for cruelty was well known among Allied intelligence, and any prisoners taken by his unit were unlikely to survive long enough to reach a proper POW camp. More importantly, returning Greta to German custody would mean condemning her to torture and death. The choice was stark: fight against overwhelming odds or watch an innocent woman die for the crime of showing compassion. The firefight, when it erupted, was brief but intense. Mitchell's first shot took down the German soldier directly behind Kruger, while Sullivan and Washington engaged the others. The SS officer himself dove for cover behind a fallen tree, drawing his sidearm and returning fire with practiced accuracy. For several minutes, the forest echoed with the crack of rifles and the whine of bullets ricocheting off trees and rocks. Greta, despite her weakened condition, proved herself capable of more than just medical knowledge. She had grabbed a rifle from the first German soldier to fall and was using it with surprising effectiveness, her shots forcing Kruger's remaining men to keep their heads down. Mitchell realized that her father's hunting trips had included more than just nature appreciation. She'd been taught to shoot, and shoot well. The tide of the battle turned when American voices could be heard approaching from the west. A patrol from Mitchell's own unit, alerted by the sound of gunfire, was moving to investigate. Kruger, recognizing that his tactical situation had become untenable, made one final attempt to complete his mission. Rising from cover, he aimed his pistol directly at Greta, his intention clear. Mitchell's shot caught the SS officer's center mass, spinning him around and dropping him to the frozen ground. Kruger tried to raise his weapon one more time, but the strength was leaving his body along with his blood. His final words, spoken in German, were a curse against the weakness he saw in showing mercy to enemies. Then Heinrich Kruger, architect of countless atrocities, died in a French forest, brought down by an American farm boy who'd chosen compassion over protocol. The arriving American patrol, led by Lieutenant Robert Hayes, found a scene that would require considerable explanation. 3 American soldiers, 1 wounded German civilian, and 5 dead German soldiers, including an SS officer, told a story that didn't fit any standard operational scenario. But as Mitchell explained what had transpired, as Greta's condition became apparent and her story emerged, the lieutenant began to understand the moral complexity of what had occurred. The journey back to Allied lines was swift, with Greta receiving immediate medical attention from the unit's medic. Her condition, while serious, was not life-threatening given proper care. More challenging was the question of what to do with a German civilian who had aided Allied personnel, but was technically an enemy national found in a combat zone. Military protocol demanded that she be turned over to intelligence personnel for interrogation and classification. Mitchell's debriefing with his commanding officer, Colonel William Patterson, was thorough and occasionally heated. The colonel understood the humanitarian impulse that had driven Mitchell's actions, but he was also responsible for maintaining military discipline and ensuring that his men followed orders. The decision to abandon a reconnaissance mission to rescue an enemy civilian, regardless of the circumstances, represented a significant breach of protocol that could not be ignored. But as the full story emerged, as Greta's intelligence value became apparent, and her genuine aid to Allied personnel was confirmed, the tone of the inquiry began to shift. Military intelligence officers were fascinated by her detailed knowledge of German medical facilities, troop movements, and the internal workings of the SS organization. Her information proved valuable enough to justify the risks Mitchell had taken, though that justification came after the fact rather than before. Greta's classification as a civilian refugee rather than a prisoner of war was ultimately determined by a board of officers who reviewed her case in detail. Her documented assistance to Allied personnel, combined with her persecution by German authorities, qualified her for protection under international law. She would remain in Allied custody for the duration of the war, but as a protected person rather than a prisoner. The personal impact of these events on both Mitchell and Greta was profound and lasting. For Mitchell, the experience had crystallized his understanding of what the war was really about, not just defeating enemy armies, but preserving the values that made victory worthwhile. He had chosen to risk everything for a stranger, because doing otherwise would have violated something fundamental in his character, something that no military order could override. For Greta, rescue by an American soldier had shattered the propaganda she'd been exposed to throughout the war. Mitchell's willingness to help her, despite the risks and against his orders, demonstrated a kind of moral courage that Nazi ideology claimed was impossible in democratic societies. Her subsequent treatment by Allied personnel, fair and humane despite her German nationality, further reinforced her growing understanding of the fundamental differences between the two sides in this conflict. The correspondence that developed between Mitchell and Greta during the remaining months of the war revealed the depth of the bond that had formed during their brief but intense shared experience. Mitchell wrote of his unit's continued operations, of the gradual push into Germany itself, of his growing hope that the war might end before too many more young men died in foreign fields. Greta responded with accounts of her work helping other refugees, of her plans to return to medicine once the fighting ended, of her gratitude for the chance to rebuild her life. When the war in Europe finally ended in May 1945, both Mitchell and Greta faced the challenge of returning to civilian life in a world forever changed by their experiences. Mitchell returned to Ohio and the family farm, but he carried with him a broader understanding of human nature and moral responsibility. The young man who had enlisted to avenge his brother's death had become someone who understood that true victory required more than just defeating enemies. It required preserving one's own humanity in the process. Greta remained in Europe, eventually settling in Switzerland where she resumed her medical career. Her work with war refugees and displaced persons became her life's mission, a way of honoring the compassion that had saved her life and giving back to a world that had shown her both the depths of human cruelty and the heights of human kindness. Her experiences during the war, particularly her rescue by an American soldier who had risked everything for a stranger, shaped her understanding of what it meant to be truly human. The letters between them continued for years after the war, a testament to the enduring impact of their shared experience. They wrote of their families, their work, their hopes for a world that might learn from the lessons of the war they had survived. Mitchell married and raised children on the Ohio farm, but he never forgot the young German woman whose life he had saved in a frozen forest. Greta never married, dedicating herself instead to her medical work, but she kept Mitchell's letters as reminders of the moment when a stranger's compassion had given her a second chance at life. In their final exchange of letters, written nearly 30 years after their encounter in the Vosges Mountains, Both reflected on the choices that had brought them together, and the impact those choices had on their subsequent lives. Mitchell wrote of his pride in his children, of his hope that they would inherit a world where such choices would be easier to make. Greta responded with gratitude for the life she had been able to build, for the patients she had been able to help, for the proof that individual acts of courage could indeed change the world. The story of Sergeant James Mitchell and Greta Hoffman became, in time, one of many examples of humanity persisting in the midst of humanity's darkest hour. It demonstrated that even in war, even when following orders seemed like the only safe choice, individuals could choose compassion over convenience, courage over compliance. Their brief encounter in a French forest had ripple effects that extended far beyond their own lives, touching everyone who heard their story and understood its deeper meaning. For in the end, Mitchell's decision to cut the ropes that bound Greta to that oak tree was more than just a rescue. It was an affirmation of the values that made victory in the war meaningful. It proved that the difference between civilization and barbarism lay not in the uniforms men wore or the flags they served, but in the choices they made when faced with another human being suffering. And in making the right choice despite the risks and against all protocol, Mitchell had won a victory that was more important than any military objective. He had preserved his own humanity, and in doing so, had helped preserve the humanity of the cause for which he fought. If you found this incredible story of courage and humanity moving, please hit that like button. It really helps us share these powerful historical moments with more people. If you're not already subscribed, make sure to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss our latest stories about the extraordinary acts of bravery that shaped our world. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have done in Sergeant Mitchell's position? Have you heard similar stories of compassion during wartime? Your engagement helps us continue bringing these important stories to light, so please take a moment to share your perspective. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.